present with us. I have the great honor to introduce the last for this day. We will introduce tomorrow, but for this day, our last final speaker, Irit Rogoff. She is a writer, curator, and organizer working at the intersection of contemporary art, critical theory, and emerging political manifestations. She is Professor of Visual Cultures at Goldsmith, London University, where she has the PhD in Curatorial Knowledge program, the MA in Global Arts program, and the new GeoCultures Research Center. Rogoff has written extensively on geography, globalization, and contemporary participatory practices in the expanded field of art. A collection of recent essays, Unbounded Limits, Possibilities, is published in 2014, this year, with the Efflux journal Sternberg, and her new book, Looking Away, Participating Singularities, Ontological Communities, is forthcoming. Rogoff is also co-founder of Free Thought, a loose collaborative platform for research, pedagogy, it's very late, and production based in London, where she lives and works. So I give the floor to you.
Thank you, Lotte, and Iris and Hans for the invitation to come and join you. And my apologies for turning up on the last day of the conference without very much knowledge of what has been said here. So it could be that everything that I'm going to say has already been said. For which I ask you for your forgiveness. I was running a conference in London yesterday, and so I couldn't be in both places. What I'm going to sort of talk about briefly, really briefly, it's late, and I'm sure you're all hungry and tired, and sated with talk, is sort of under the rubric of what I'm interested in now, which I'm calling the way we work now. And this is coming from a sort of a variety of sources. At a slightly confessional level, I've reached the age where I have to sit on a lot of committees and funding bodies and so on. And it was explained to me that this is part of my duties. And this is enormously frustrating. I spent half my life arguing for things that I never actually managed to get funded. And spent huge amounts of time doing this. And one of the things that I have understood in this process is that the sort of the terrain of the management and the evaluation of knowledge have changed quite dramatically, in the sense that in all of the bodies in which I've sat for the last 2 or 3 years, there has been absolutely no debate about the legitimacy of this subject or that subject. Everything is legitimate for research. Under neoliberalism, there is no sort of, let's say, hierarchy of subjects. The absolute fault line is questions of method. There are legitimate ways of knowing and there are illegitimate ways of knowing. And methodology is the fault line in the management of knowledge production. And this interested me very much. And so I've kind of really shifted my preoccupations to the way we work, to the how and not to the what. And what I wanted to do here is to touch really briefly on 3 dimensions of what I see to be this project. Someone in the panel, I think it was you, Daniel, mentioned a sort of tradition within the art world or working critically within institutions, and that is a tradition that I also come from and value very much. I'm very interested in the tensions of inside-outside, and sort of hope never to have to be in the position of making a choice between either. So the movement, the constant movement between research-intensive environments and sort of open circulations of participatory knowledge is to me a very valuable and potentially quite rich one. And the three sort of bits of this project that I'm going to talk about have to do largely with these intersections. Two of them are my own work, and the whole infrastructure project is a project that I work on with Free Thought, the collective that I'm part of, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. At this moment we can see an intersection between what is taking place around how we teach and learn, how we gather, how we research, and how we produce knowledge, as well as how it circulates. What is so interesting about these movements and intersections is that they perform the complete opposite of what neoliberal ideology and policy have been trying to convince us are the necessary shifts in expectations from knowledge. So if neoliberal ideology is arguing that education and knowledge and research must be instrumental, must be efficient, must lead to employment, to industrial and other forms of application, that people need to learn professions and not bodies of critical thought, that learning cannot be about speculation, but only about certainty, that there is a complete divorce between our political and cultural selves, and that the process of education or the protocols of research we follow, in actuality, what we are seeing is the exact opposite. And I'm talking about much more than the fact that young incoming students are going towards English literature degrees, entirely unexpected by conservative governments, or that even my own slightly obscure and inexplicable field of visual culture is drawing in record numbers of students. While these are interesting, I suspect that they are primarily instances of individualism, the desire for self-expression, in the face of the entire trajectory of neoliberal facades. Now, I have pulled together, as I said very briefly, three instances of what I consider to be the way we work now. The first of those sort of operates under the rubric of the educational term. And what I'm interested in here is over the past decade, and kind of unprecedented mobility, ideas out of research-intensive environments, so higher education environments and laboratories, out of research-intensive environments into the sort of realm of creative practices, where new protocols are developed for their delivery. So the sort of where there is a movement of ideas, there's absolutely no similarity between the way these ideas are approached in universities or in other research-intensive environments, and the way in which they make themselves manifest within the arena of creative practices. In the arena of creative practices, completely new protocols for the delivery of thinking, of ideas, of notions of research are developed. These new protocols have then sort of moved outwards into the arenas of social and political protest. And so one of the things that has really interested me in the last decade is this movement between, just to use a shorthand, between universities into the art world, and from the art world as a set of new protocols into the arena of social and political protest. And this is what I'm calling the educational term. Over the past decade, learning, teaching, art practices, knowledge production, and knowledge dissemination have been characterized by an ever-increasing, ever more complex, and often remarkably coordinated set of transactions between higher education institutions, art world institutions and forums, ranging from the self-organized and independent to the commercial, the public to the private, the mainstream to the marginal. And 3, NGOs, global protest and political movements. The trend is ongoing, with recent emergence of a proliferation of hundreds of self-organized free universities, and with movements such as Los Indignados, Occupy, the Movement for Social Justice, the Greek Protest Committee, Tahrir Square, Gezi Park, Hong Kong Students for Democracy at this very moment, positioning a wide range of study situations and forums as strategically crucial for their movements. All these are enabled by the considerable focus on research and education within contemporary arts and curatorial practices, and by the innovative protocols these have developed. These shifts have been in many ways informed by, 1, the movement of ideas from university to contemporary art environments via multiple education initiatives, such as research exhibitions, para-academies, seminars and reading groups taking place in the latter. 2, alterations in research funding protocols, exhibition-making protocols, and the emergence of self-organized public spheres for knowledge, and which have affected, even necessitated, such changes. And 3, the centrality of self-education forums within recent social and political movements. All have rewritten facets of the perceived work of these institutions and challenged both the aims of and the audiences for research and education. And this is sort of a very fluid, I think, kind of set of mobilities. I'm very interested in many sort of facets and levels of what is going on in the Middle East at the moment in terms of exceptional proliferation of both sort of heavy-duty top-down institutions in terms of building infrastructures for culture, and an extraordinary range of self-organized artists associations, sort of working bottom-up. And both are sort of talking to each other in quite interesting ways. I was having a conversation with Regine Hassakian, who was trying to set up a small NGO for contemporary arts practice in Damascus. Sorry, no, in Baghdad. And she was saying, where do you start? There are no libraries, the Art Academy is destroyed, everybody has left the country. The culture, which was trilingual between Arabic, French, and English, is monolingual in Arabic, so we can't even bring in people to Skype from abroad. I don't know where to start. And we had this very, very interesting conversation about where to start. And one of the things that this conversation resulted in was a sort of recognition that in sort of situations that we might call zero-degree situations, research is a very good place to start, because the more complex the conditions of people's lives, the more understanding they have of research. And so the sort of the paradigm of research, which is one really of a disorderly assemblage of entities, is one that moves with incredible fluidity from highly structured, organized, funded situations to fairly chaotic ones in which you don't know where to start. And this is one of the things that makes research interesting. It's not, you know, the sort of super funded laboratories that define the notion of research. Other constituencies are constantly defining what is research. So this sort of set of questions that I have They require conceptual thought, they require a certain amount of data assembly about these emergent phenomenon, as well as the sort of assembly of numerous knowledges and arenas of practice, in order to pull together a subject which is just coming into being. Its impacts range across the academy, art institutions, and public sphere occurrences, and the growing porousness between these. Now here are some instances of background. In September 2007, No Border Academy was founded in Ceuta on the Moroccan-Spanish border. Over a week, 400 participants studied the conditions of migration within the EU and the lives of the various borders in the immediate area, thus making the border a set of experiences and knowledges rather than simply a set of lines of division between countries and legal orders. In 2009, the Serpentine Gallery, one of London's premier contemporary art spaces, facilitated the establishment of the School for Possible Studies in a nomadic series of spaces around the city, in a really interesting set of dialogues with developers whose properties were not at that moment in use and therefore could be redeployed momentarily for such a project. Now in its 6th year of activity, the school brings together international coalitions of alternative knowledge production in numerous forms, including exhibitions and publications and seminars and dance classes, working with the Theatre of the Oppressed and numerous organizations, both in Europe and the Middle East. In November 2012, the commercial gallery Carol Fletcher, situated in the heart of London's West End, launched a reading group on the subject of organizing for the anti-capitalist transition, open to all comers. The reading group featured a text by the acclaimed academic David Harvey and was facilitated by a professor of architecture from Westminster University and by the editor of the respected journal Radical Philosophy. In September 2012, the noted international arts and theatre festival Steirischer Herbst in the city of Graz, Austria, turned itself into a study camp around the topic of truth is concrete, funding numerous performances and scholars, artists, activists, and delegations of students from 12 institutions of higher education across Europe to discuss possibilities of insisting on truthfulness in public culture. On November 21st, 2013, the group, New Cross Commoners, entered a decommissioned library in South London and began a performative reading action, according to a curriculum they had set themselves, returning the library to its original dedication, a random selection of activities. Each of these activities described above is grounded in extensive study, complex theorization, and an emphasis on developing new protocols for collective practice, display, and dissemination. They are not simply the spontaneous expression of frustration or protest. They also use the infrastructures of study and creative practice and the forms of higher education, learning, and research to actualize their aims. Over the past 36 months, protest movements around the world have included a very substantial component of self-education and autonomous publishing as part of their activities. And this, to me, has been one of the most interesting aspects of a set of let's say, shared values between movements that actually have very little in common, or maybe have in common what Saskia Sassen calls the work of citizenship. But the sort of political specificities that have produced each one of these is really different. But there is something about the sort of format. There is something about the absolute insistence on producing study situations, research situations, publishing situations within these protest movements. The fact that almost every Occupy situation has a library, right? And a quite extensive library. I think that this has been sort of one of the most interesting aspects of them as a kind of co-joint phenomenon. Now, this is a phenomenon generally unmarked by scholars, but taken up by the professional press. For example, Jack Grove, writing in the Times Higher Educational, said, "A university does not need a charter or even walls. Open minds are enough," argue groups whose challenges to educational convention have been invigorated by recent protest movements. So one of the things that has been extremely interesting to me is where is, let's say, more progressive thought about the absolute necessary porousness of educational and research institutions, where is that support coming from? The idea that it's coming from protest movements is a kind of reverse of power relations, which is extremely interesting, and I think quite necessary. It is important to stress the degree to which the international press has recognized the significance of this shift. When Time magazine declared the person of the year 2011 to be the protester, it is now our task to both ground this perception in entities, in research entities, as well as to introduce it through the new practice-based research methodologies that will allow us to shape kind of new lexicons for contemporary education in inventive and imaginative narrative modes. This protest in this instance is not the spontaneous expression of frustration or dissent, but a critical project requiring being better informed and re-articulating the questions of the day. And probably Occupy did more than any other of the movements to say that is our task. Our task is the re-articulation of the questions of the day. The particular forms of these initiatives have taken directly from a proliferation of contemporary artistic and curatorial practices which have focused on knowledge in the public sphere and on the invention of new models for accessing it. For example, one of London's major spaces, the Hayward Gallery, established the Wide Open School in 2012, inviting 100 artists from 40 countries to hold classes all over the city over 1 month. And this was sort of very interesting because the wide openness of the school was both the constitution of subjects for the teaching situations, which did not in any way emulate conventional subject formation, but also the sort of opportunity for whoever was coming in to teach a class or a seminar to choose anywhere in the city to do so. And then what the Hayward did was negotiate the possibility. So I went to a seminar taught by Pedro Lash and Stefano Harni on post-colonial economies, which took place in the London Eye, you know that huge Ferris wheel, where they hired a capsule for 40 people, and we went twice. And Pedro Lash sort of pasted on the walls of this capsule transparencies with illustrations of colonial economies. And we could see the City of London, the financial district, which is called the City of London, sort of filtered through these transparencies of Mexican pyramids, etc. So the sort of the conjunctions of how to reanimate spaces, how to redeploy a whole set of environments that are essentially hostile environments to the production of knowledge, but can be redeployed in order to produce a dimension within that process, is something that I think is quite significant. The conjunction of conceptualizing a subject, staging it in locations which are subsequently reconfigured as a result, and finding an innovative format through which to bring about the knowledge characterizes such enterprises. These educational events, some of literally hundreds taking place daily across the world, exemplify a significant transition in the ways in which learning, teaching, knowledge production and dissemination have undergone a radical change over the past decade. The movement between universities and research-driven environments, contemporary arts and cultural spaces, and global protest movements has rewritten many facets of the work and of these institutions themselves. These have challenged both the aims and the audiences for research. And this, for me, is one of the most interesting aspects of the educational term. Research has an audience, right? Research is not the instrumentalized result of a process that then goes into very strict and limited protocols of knowledge or its application. Research today has a global audience. So these have challenged both the aims and the audiences for research, the exclusive designation of the use of art spaces, the potential for reformulated learning forums, and not least, the surprisingly central role of self-education within global protest movements, which has emerged from all of these other shifts. So this is one aspect of what I'm interested in and what I'm thinking about under the rubric of the way we know now. Another aspect, and this is one that Free Thought is a loose collective of 6 people, myself, Stefano Harney, Massimiliano Molona, who's an anthropologist, Adrian Heathfield, who's a performance theorist, Nora Sternfeld, who's an educator and a curator, and Luis Moreno, who's an urbanist. And we have dedicated 3 years to this kind of very large-scale project on infrastructure. And infrastructure is, to me, the way in which infrastructure can be rethought away from largely planning protocols which didn't really define it in the physical environment. I took on board that you, Felix, were talking about a slightly different understanding of an immaterial infrastructure. That this is absolutely part of the sort of potentials for shifts in ways of knowing. So largely captive by planning discourse, infrastructure is seen as the ultimate mode of technical organizational support delivery. Sewage, energy, capital, flow, traffic, transportation, food, information technology, transglobal services are seemingly the building blocks of contemporary geodemographic organizations. Given that infrastructures are the building blocks of capitalism's modus operandi, that they have been detached from both ideological convictions and textual operations, is there a potential to think this model of efficient delivery critically, to introduce both subjectivity and incoherence into its working? Can what Raymond Williams famously referred to as structures of feeling be thought of as an infrastructure of feeling? So one of the things that we're interested in is to think infrastructures away from that which makes possible, and to recognize the degree to which they are as much inhabited by making things impossible, by blockages and stoppages, as they are by sort of free flows of delivery. And the other is what are the relations between infrastructure and subjectivity, which is, of course, where the sort of intersection of infrastructure and kind of new formats of education meet. Within the kind of para-educational practices I am discussing, infrastructure is occupied, subverted, mimicked, rethought. So not only do existing infrastructures get used as hosts by initiatives that are very far from the way in which they justify themselves. New Cross Commoners, which is a group of people, largely people who've completed PhDs at Goldsmiths, which is an institution that is located in southeast London in an area called New Cross. So they have done a whole series, and I can't go into in great detail into New Cross Commoners, but they have a website of sorts. They are deeply against the idea of self-publicity, so they have a rather obscure and mysterious website, but you can find out a bit about them. But they've sort of done a whole series of what I think are quite interesting moves. One of them is, having graduated from the university, they didn't leave. So they've continued to inhabit this terrain in southeast London in a different way. They're using a lot of the tools that they gained during their study and their research in order to re-inhabit the terrain. They are designating a whole series of decommissioned public spaces. I don't know, I really don't know what the situation is in the rest of Europe, but in Britain we have huge numbers of decommissioned libraries. Libraries are no longer considered to be places worthy of investment, and unfortunately digital culture is the excuse for this. So we have decommissioned libraries that are either being rented out to the private sector or redeployed in different ways. And so they have designated a whole set of formerly public educational spaces, re-inhabited them, and forced them to go back to some kind of original. And it's a kind of very quiet and very low level of activity, much of which is about reading in public, a commitment to reading in public. And, but it's also about the sort of defiance of the kind of timelines that an accelerated kind of neoliberal culture around education has forced on us. You know, 3 years you do your BA, you graduate, you get a job, you pay back the £40,000 you owe for your BA, etc., etc. So they're sticking around, they're redeploying their knowledges, they're re-inhabiting spaces, and they're producing kind of models of commoning. So an initiative of commoning in the location in which people live, in which the location is quite central. But alternative infrastructures are developed. It is here that the seemingly natural link between infrastructure and levels of development gets estranged. And these are the kinds of disruptions that I'm looking for. The way in which the School of Possible Studies is housed in absolutely extraordinary sort of mansions in central London for a year while a developer is getting the capital together to develop it into whatever, and producing a completely different set of meanings in the inhabitation of the space, or what this group that I've just been talking about. So infrastructure and levels of development get estranged through the insertion of certain kinds of educational, of gathering, of reading, of researching practices. And necessarily critical recognition that one of the, this is another dimension of why I think infrastructure is crucial for this kind of rethinking about education, is the fact that it is the vehicle for a necessary critical recognition that one of the primary conceits of the West is its superior infrastructure, its capacity for infrastructural thought, by which is meant that how things are going to come about is as central as what they are, who is involved, what energies, vitalities, and desires they bring to the arena, why this might be urgent or important, etc. Obviously, these are the logics of the market, but they have moved seamlessly into cultural institutions with very little questioning. The emphasis on institutional infrastructure, such as we see in Qatar, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Sharjah, and across East Asia, exemplifies this privileging of the functioning structural over any other category of critical thought that we might associate with cultural activity. Recently, within the context of a small and bloody awful conference I attended in Amsterdam called What is the Post-Colonial Exhibition? Somebody was there? I heard the director of Tate Modern produce a triumphalist account of the numbers of visitors, users, purchasers the museum had recently made. It turned out that his understanding of the issue at hand, of trying to think what a post-colonial exhibition might actually be, has to do with Tate looking at their collections and recognizing that it had certain gaps in it. Gaps, as we know, being a very unacceptable thing. Subsequent to this realization, they have resolved the problem by going on an international shopping spree to fill these gaps. Most objectionable of all is that the shopping spree has been financed by wealthy collectors from these very cultural gaps themselves, who have been persuaded of the importance of work from their home countries being part of the collection and cultural infrastructure of one of the West's most glitzy institutions. Within the world of cultural practices, we think of infrastructure as enabling. We think that it is an advantageous set of circumstances through which we might achieve an equal playing field, redress the wrongs of the world, and redress the balance of power within a post-slavery, post-colonial, post-communist world of endless war. This redress is always a binding of representation enfolded within the structures of a seemingly dignifying, seemingly enabling infrastructure. We see this across a broad spectrum, whether this be an inclusion of the discussion of slavery into the protocols of the UN, the Durban Conference on World Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance. This was its title. Which is the ultimate sort of non-elected world governance system, or the inclusion of a neglected and invisible artistic tradition, such as art from the Arab world, into the schedule of an august Western institution, such as the Museum of Modern Art. But whatever the position, there is a sense that the incorporation of this work into the ultimate infrastructure, political, cultural, or technocratic, that it ignored its very existence for so long, is a benchmark. A contested one, but definitely a benchmark of achievement, of a seeming change in attitudes. What if, however, the concept of infrastructure was thought against the grain of inclusion, enablement, and achievement, and became the site of critical investigation of the frictions between expression and organization? But infrastructure is not simply a body of materials and instances to be studied. It also proposes a challenge to the very operations on inquiry. I should say at the outset that for me, the interest in infrastructure is to a large extent part of the struggle of trying to figure out how to work. So for me, infrastructure is not a set of objectified entities in the external world. It's about a certain kind of intellectual political structure of trying to understand how to work. How to move away from subjects or themes or materials that have been legitimated as such by disciplinary discourses or by political movements, trying to move away from existing categories of what and how we know, and trying to move away from expertise as such. This abdication of expertise in favor of some form of inhabitation of stage, knowledge, and sound, when I have encountered it in the recent work of the choreographer-dancer Anna Teresa de Keersmacher, was exceptionally moving for someone like me who does intellectual work. In particular, because it was not a withdrawal, an exit, a named failure. In a series of pieces that foreground the indecision of artistic process and the inability of one's expertise to actually allow one to do what one would hope to do, de Keersmacher stresses that these partial collapses are the actual subject of the work, as opposed to the ability to cohere and produce a finished product. And the third element of this sort of reflection on the way we work now is sort of towards a practice of method. And here, I think one of the things, and I think the elements of other aspects of it are present within it, but one of the things that really interest me is those moments, which is what happens, I think, within, let's say, what we might call practice-driven research. It's the moments in which a paradigm shift emerges as a set of permissions. So a paradigm shift doesn't emerge as a conceptualization of the new, which actually, not even for Thomas Kuhn did a paradigm operate as the conceptualization of the new. It was much more an aggregate and a set of movements. But what really interests me is how does a paradigm shift translate itself into a set of operational permissions in a field? And what do those permissions mean? There's a postcard of a work by Gabriela Rofko that has been sitting on my desk for nearly a decade now. It shows a puddle in a street in Paris. At the edges of the puddle, several lines made by bicycle wheels can be seen. The bikes have ridden through the puddle and left tire marks on exiting in different directions. The image is iconic for me. It somehow captures how I would like to work, and that is why it has sat on my desk as a reminder for so long. Something happened, something minor, with no great significance in the world. It cannot be recaptured, and it cannot be narrated back into some coherent story. We don't know who they were, and we don't know where they were going. But they were here, and they made their mark, and somehow they altered the site. Something happened, Deleuze has said. We can spend our time trying to trace it back into existing structures and modes of knowing, or we can move forward with its affects. I choose the latter. Starting in the middle, not explaining, not letting puzzlement produce empirical questions, thinking that rather than tell the stories of the bicyclists, I might take up their journey. I have at this moment many permissions of how I might work, and many of these permissions are a direct product of the other two sort of elements of this sort of thinking that I was describing. So I have at this moment many permissions of how I might work, but they are not a menu from which to order. Not simply a set of templates to choose from as one would a style. Each set of permissions is underwritten by certain critical exhortations, and each makes a demand and requires a risk. At present, we have the possibility of working in ways, inventive and experimental, that critically embody the critical insights of the past 40 years of the project of critique. So one of the things that I think is really interesting, and this is something that goes back to sort of earlier preoccupations, where for me it was very, very important to distinguish between mid-20th century project of criticism, the ability to produce evaluative judgment of quality, etc. The sort of late 20th century project of critique, and the interrogations of the kind of assumptions that underwrite knowledge claims. And what for me is a much more contemporary process, which I call, not brilliantly, I think it's not a great term, but I haven't got another one, so that's it, which I call criticality, and which is the sort of situation in which we are, on the one hand, tremendously well equipped critically and theoretically, analytically, intellectually, politically, to sort of to analyze and unveil and lay open and really inspect the sort of situation in which we find ourselves subject to. And on the other hand, we live out those conditions. So we have to work both experientially and analytically, and that is what I'm calling criticality. So the sort of these permissions of possible ways of working, which are on the one hand inventive and experimental, are also the critical embodiment of the past 40 years of critique. That is what is driving them is critique, not sort of imaginative leaps, and that's quite important for me. That the drive is critique and not leaps of the imagination. So what are these permissions? The subject cannot be defined. The sign cannot be stabilized. We ask not what something is, but what it makes possible. We recognize difference as an internal dynamic rather than as an embodied identity. We gather as singularities rather than as identities. And we invent our politics rather than fight over their meager remains. Rather than digging for hidden knowledge, we recognize the secret in full light. And rather than fit in with designated readerships, we constitute new audiences. And you try telling that to a publisher. That is the way we work now. Moving beyond factual analysis, quantitative measuring, contextual historicizing and theorizing, we have permission to engage in fictionalizing, docudramatizing, bureaucratic mimicry, in the invention of subjects and of archives. And not only do we have the possibility of producing these conceptual revisions, but we can also inhabit these in a variety of performative affects. We can be serious, or hilarious, or seductive, or delirious, or confused, or severe. Perhaps most importantly, we have permissions to constitute new subjects from the detritus lying at the edges of previous subjects. New subjects that we arrive at through circuitous paths. New subjects that cannot be captured so easily by the regimes of disciplines or expertise of clearly defined fields. The constitution of a new subject is not a fresh or daring take on an old subject being the war on Iraq, or the supply lines of natural resources, or the polyphonic urban environment, etc. These are subjects in the world, and much of what we see in academic or creative work are fresh insights, new entry points into already constituted subjects. But they are not the constitution of new subjects. And of course, a new subject will generate new archives from which to read it. It will bring in new actors who can play a part in it. In fact, it will do everything but enact the protocols of representation. At the moment in which we have a clear idea of what the subject is, we have already lost the attempt to constitute it, for it needs to constitute us if it is to take its place in the world. Years ago, at a conference in London, venerable art historian Alex Potts got up after a talk and said passionately, "I come to this talk as a reader of Martin Bernal." And my heart warmed to him for the first time, and I thought to myself, how wonderful that Alex is not here as himself, but as one who has internalized the voice of Martin Bernal, who in turn makes him hear other things and in a different way. At this moment in post-representational knowledge production, or curating, or researching, or instituting new forms for study, it is politically imperative that we constitute new subjects. Since 2007, we have lived out the bankruptcy of the old subjects, but have yet to make the bold step of inventing new ones, rather than taking up positions around the old ones. We have been externalizing our wrath against the banks, rather than understanding that we are now mini-banking instances, plotting out the course of our lives through moments of self-investment and share flotation, each of us aground with an aspiration to global markets, mini-instances in which human capital is our only self-definition. And so, each time we galvanize to put forward one of these efforts at producing new subjects, or at working by inventing a protocol for the work, we effect an act of unbelonging, and we take the risk associated with such departures. We unbelong ourselves from the designated sites and the methodologies of knowledge and its protocols. We also unbelong from having a position, and we risk the loss of familiar affiliations, even navigational paths, the kind of risk that Hannah Arendt took when she wrote Eichmann in Jerusalem. Harney and Moten in the Undercommons speak of the concept of fugitive study, an internal digression that undermines knowledge or practice from within, but without making such claims, right? So it does not make claim to be revolutionary or radical knowledge. It undermines protocols from within. So fugitive study becomes an integral, internal part of what it is to study, rather than an external opposition against what is studied or how it is studied. So study in risk, research in risk, knowledge production in risk is a critical impulse that can propose operational modes. But we mustn't romanticize risk, neither as individual courage or as critical radicality, for risk is equally part of late capitalism's risk economies, in which the vicissitudes of venture capital, the high risk of nuclear power, of fracking technologies, or the instability of so-called international terror are at the heart of our most major economies of financialization, of resources, and of security. Risk is taken into account within these economies, or at a more radical level, it is what drives these economies. And so one of the tasks, it seems to me, within the sort of new operational modes of research, of education, of inquiry, and within the kind of larger framework of the educational turn, which has made them an element of the protocols of political practice, is to rethink the relations between risk and knowledge. Risk not as that which is entirely calculated within the necessary operations, but risk is something that sits on the border of those operations and constantly kind of polices, let's say, the difference between the rehearsal of previously existing subjects and the possibility of constituting new subjects. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for this very rich and wonderful lecture. And before, do you hear me?
Yes.
Before I give the floor to the questions, I allow myself a little anecdote. I was invited for an interview for a job for a museum, and I used this image of Roscoe for the idea how I imagine a collection. I didn't get the job. Okay, question?
We're so sorry.
Yes.
I'm actually happy to be here, so.
It is very late.
Yeah, so thank you. I was interested in, if I understood well, your description, or no, you're bringing up inconsistent infrastructures. And I was wondering if you could give an example of what that would mean. What would be, in your mind or in your work, an inconsistent infrastructure?
Well, and I think that, you know, one of we've sort of decided, we've been asked to curate two enormous projects, one in Norway, Free Thought, this collective, one in Norway and one in South Korea. They are devoted to examinations of infrastructure. And one of the things that is interesting within, let's say, the language of infrastructures is that they are largely uninhabited, right? So they're structural systems that are largely uninhabited. So one of the things that's kind of interesting is how do you re-inhabit infrastructure? You know, who's there? And it's not, you know, it's not a kind of romantic attempt to put the workers back into the work, although, you know, that has its place as well. But it's the kind of attempt to understand, for example, we were talking about this and one of my colleagues suddenly started singing a song from Detroit, from the first big strike in the automotive industry in Detroit in the 1960s. And the song went something like, I'm not 100% sure, but it went something like, please, Mr. Foreman, slow down the line. I don't mind working, but I do mind dying. And the sort of the re-inhabitation of, let's say, infrastructures of labor, not just with labor, but with the sort of the hesitations and the kind of stutters that labor produces in smooth delivery, is one of the ways in which one can kind of begin to recognize the sort of the way in which an infrastructure both makes something possible and makes something impossible. So one of the, I think, tragedies in the discussion of infrastructure in terms of the kind of the technocracies of material realities and flows within our world is that it is being defined by planning. That's where infrastructure gets defined all the time. And it is about the sort of, in essence, it's about the flow of capital and the production of, you know, new intensities of capital in different places. So do you ever watch CNN? You should watch CNN. It's very educational. And one of the really interesting things about CNN is that between programs, which are news and business basically, there is endless advertising by emergent nation states for investment And all of the advertising was about infrastructure. So basically what you get is Ruritania, which is mythical English. Something that comes from British comedies in the turn of the 20th century. A mythical country called Ruritania. So Ruritania has wonderful landscapes, picture, lovely indigenous populations, picture, and wonderful modern infrastructure ready for Western investment. So the sort of the way in which infrastructure operates as the subjugation of certain kinds of realities to other overriding logics. And I think that that is true in the infrastructures of knowledge and in the infrastructures of culture. And it is precisely the kind of the incongruities that are really interesting. And this goes, Walid Rad has a project which just finished last week, which is called 52 Weeks of Gulf Labor, in which 52 artists made work about the cost to human life and human well-being of the kind of building of cultural institutions in the Gulf. I think something like 360 people have died in the process of the building of, the Guggenheim, the Louvre, NYU, the sort of this and that. So that's quite a dramatic disruption of the constitution of infrastructure. But you can sort of take, and I think they wanted to be dramatic. I think they wanted to just flag, a sort of problem. And what was really interesting was to make it everybody's problem. They took the Gulf situation and they did what globalization sort of theorists call scaling up. They scaled it up. They made it everybody's problem. They made it a general cultural problem. So I think these are some of the ways in which one is kind of complicating the notion of infrastructure away from smooth, efficient, neutral delivery, which is how it's kind of circulating through planning.
Maybe because this came out of this anecdote, this union song, and there was and maybe it's a question. I'm not quite sure, and I use now very popular or populistic certain kind of terms. Let's say some of these elements appear in a moment when something is on the edge of becoming invisible and of disappearing. And there is this, I love the project, but I would say maybe if we're speaking about this emotional aspect which you described in the first section, there is a certain kind, and you already make a block of the self-fulfilling question about romanticism. There is an interesting project which was in Taipei, in Taiwan. They lost by the success of the mainland in heavy industrial production. They lost all the industrial production to China. And there's an artist agency who developed together with the worker protest songs. To give them an opportunity to have a voice on the street. But the demand on it to do it was already on the edge of the disappearance. Then the question would be, is the narrative about it romanticism? Or is it still an opportunity of action?
And I think you're absolutely right. I think that it is the sort of slippery nature of infrastructures that they very quickly sort of sink into the sand and are invisible. And I actually, for myself, don't have a huge interest in excavating the invisible and making it visible. because I think it's active in its invisibility in a really interesting way, so I don't want to sort of make the invisible visible. But I think that in relation to infrastructure, what slightly bothered me about the 52 weeks of Gulf labor, or about my colleagues starting to sing on stage sort of protest songs from Detroit, is that I'm not sure that we need to privilege injustice as that by which we uncover the complex operations of infrastructure. So while it's very attractive, I'm not 100% sure about that. I attended a project that sort of took place at the edges of one of the Venice Biennales, which was called Call the Witness, in which was testimonies of Roma people in Europe, but also of lots and lots of people working with Roma. So one of the things that emerged, I mean, from the Roma, what one got was experience. But one of the things that emerged from all the people who were sort of working with them was the degree to which they both interacted with and exposed the working of certain kinds of infrastructure. So, for example, there was a group of sort of city workers who had worked with Roma community in, I think, 2 or 3 Italian cities to sort of take the work of rubbish collection and recycling to various sites out of the city. And they said yes. I mean, it did all kinds of things for the community in terms of work and blah, blah, blah. But actually, it completely rewrote the scenario of rubbish and recycling and refuse and so on and so on. So it became a kind of, through a set of urban disruptions and an attempt to set up alternative economies that would quiet these urban disruptions. Actually, the entire sort of setup of the infrastructure of refuse collection and recycling in that city shifted completely. Those seem to me to be, not purely driven by questions of injustice, but also systemic and structural and, addressing multiple sort of constituencies. And that seems to be more interesting. I think I can start drinking, no?
Yeah, sure.
I'm really down.
It's something, it's a kind of observation or something that you say to build a new cycle. And also connecting with the first part of your speech about the Occupy movement and about the infrastructure that they were using. And also, you say that the people is coming from the university to the street and then something.
No, I don't think it's the people. I think it's the ideas.
The ideas.
I think
but also,
it's far less interesting if it's the people.
yeah.
I think it's the ideas. And the sort of the fact that something which is talked about in one way within, let's say, the university, then moves into the art world and becomes a sort of a different discussion, but mostly gains a completely different format. Yeah. Its delivery is not, the endless analytical earnestness of the university. It becomes a different, it becomes objectified in an interesting way.
But
and then it moves into...
I would like you, because there is I make a comparing, for example, the movie made here, the Stuttgart 21, that the people start to reclaim the street for many years, something about the city planning here in the city and something. And then I asked the same question in Barcelona and in Madrid when the people start to reclaim also the center. And then also to compare the same, this kind of, I made the same question in Chile, in Santiago de Chile, when the students started, and they are totally different generations, but also that you said the ideas, but also the leaders Most of the leaders are coming from there. Also, is that happening with Syriza now in Greek. But also, I don't know if you know this Podemos, this new party in Spain, that this is moving very, very fast. And they're presenting the candidate for the European Parliament, and they gave 5 members of the European Parliament. So only in 1 month, they get 1.5 million votes. And they are growing up very, very fast. And they are talking about new politics and new ways of it. And it's for me, it's a very new effect. And also how to deal with the new subject. It's the question is if you can make an observation about it. Because also Carmina Vallejo, that was at that time the leader in Santiago de Chile, was 22 years old. And now is a member of the government of the Bachelor.
You know, I'm in the middle of all this, so you know, I don't have perfect answers to anything. I'm sort of thinking about a lot of things. But I think at the heart of it is I'm thinking about how central education is to the self-articulation of things that look completely contradictory. Right? So the sort of how central education is to the kind of the project of becoming a so-called productive member of society, to protesting precisely that productivity, to working on the margins in ways that are imaginative and inventive, and yet everywhere this quite formal taking up of education is apparent. I think that for me, and I'm not sure I can work with it quite yet, but there is a sort of difference in. A few years ago, there was an exhibition in Berlin of RAF, of the Rote Armee Fraktion, and the KW. And I think it was very debated whether it should take place or not. I can't remember the sort of that. But I went on a kind of freezing January day. It wasn't a particularly interesting exhibition. The whole place was empty, except the 2 rooms that were full of books and magazines and newspapers and films of that period. Those had hundreds of people sitting on a freezing concrete floor in a building with no heating for hours reading. And the sort of, and I thought it's so interesting. RAF was a self-education program, and it has generated in its audience a process of self-education. Because they weren't interested in looking at all the art that, supposedly artistically described the ethos of RAF. So there was a kind of process of identification and self-education. Now, the sort of the desire to articulate yourself through previous generations, kind of critical formulation, as opposed to the desire to produce your own critical formulation, is something which I think is this last 4 or 5 years has really sort of, because we, a lot of us got invited to come and give talks in all these tent universities and banks of ideas and so on. There was an absolute distinction. They would say, tell us about the historical model of this, right? Without any kind of illusion that it was actually a contemporary model. But they wanted to be informed about what came before. And within the neoliberal institutions of culture and education that they attend, they're not informed about the previous, revolutionary sort of models. It's not useful education. And so I think that we have to make distinctions between identification and between a sort of the desire to re-articulate questions in very, very contemporary. So what was interesting to me, when Occupy London was not on the scale of Occupy New York, but it was in 2 locations and it was quite embattled. And they published something called the Occupy Times. The only aspect of Occupy London that has persisted after it disbanded was the Occupy Times. It continues to publish. And it continues, and it says this is our most important platform. The platform of articulating questions, of writing, of sort of examining, is really, it's much more important than our physical presence in the street. And that, I think that that's a real shift. And that, for me, that's the educational term.
Then I would suggest also to intervene again. It gets this attention by the fact that they proclaim the street. So there is not that you can, the interlink is very strong between this position to say we proclaim the street, we say this is a public area and where we are operating, and from there we start a media relationship. And not the opposite way around. We say first the public sphere, as you mentioned also before. What is this public sphere? From where you're rethinking. And one example is the structure of the internet. It's not something which you can separate from the physical proclaiming of physical space.
But I think that, thinking about, and I came to the second half of your panel, thinking about Felix Stadler's talk, that notion that the public sphere is something that you can enter by virtue of the process of educated articulation, the Habermasian notion of a classic public sphere, it's no longer the operating notion of the public sphere within social and political protest movements. I think that as an educator, one of the things that I find most interesting is how much time and effort is going into teaching yourself to articulate. Right? There's no assumption that if you produce these formulations or those formulations, you have a place in public. There's the whole process is one of teaching oneself to sort of articulate and re-articulate.
Hi.
Hi.
How are you? I have this friend Paolo. He's a great guy. He makes games and he teaches game making and thinking at the CMU, which is a school. And at the end of last, or year before last, I forget, he said that after teaching a very sincerely leftist course in a country like that, and having brilliant people, he was impressed to find out that 5 of the top of the list, top of the class, kids in his, because have just graduated, have applied for jobs with NSA. After having learned all there is to know about really deeply critical thinking in contemporary games making, which is like a very important genre of distributed knowledge. Now, like you said, you're an educator. Do you know who you are educating? And what is the next step in the destiny of your thoughts? And I sincerely admire your thinking. I like the way you explain it right now. But I'm asking myself, what is the half-life? What happens to your thoughts, which are rearticulating your relationship with infrastructures? What happens to them once they land with your audience, with young people of today? And how many of them are going to be building infrastructures for the man? And how many are going to keep looking for an adversarial position? And are you preoccupied with that? Because that is a slight danger with what you're proposing here. You're teaching the owner of the infrastructure where they are weak. And you're helping them repair it, so to say, from the aspect of efficacy or better working in a better neoliberal world of theirs.
You can't. Yeah, I think I see where you're going with this. You can't be an educator and worry about where the knowledge is going, because the sort of if you're an educator, I think what you're preoccupied with is the event of knowledge. You're preoccupied with that moment in which a whole set of subjectivities, informed by, some ideas, sort of come together and produce the event of knowledge. It's not reproducible. You don't say to people, okay, so we kind of produce this kind of encounter between our subjectivities and some ideas that we've encountered, some practices, maybe we even produced a project out of it. Now go and propagate that in the world. What you're hoping is that there's a principle of the event of knowledge which will keep happening, that they will be, slightly more aware of being able to sort of contribute to, or to even stage. And so I don't think of knowledge as reproducible. So, and I think that trajectory that you're outlining, that you put something out and then people take it and, they take it somewhere else and they do bad things with it or good things with it or whatever. For me, that's not the point. The point is to instantiate the event of knowledge and to sort of produce it out of encounters between legitimate materials, illegitimate materials, sort of all of the subjectivities that are involved in the encounter, and a set of external urgencies that we have to address. And on the rare occasions that actually takes place, then we have, what I would call the event of knowledge. I think that the other thing that somehow kind of slipped away, my fault entirely, in all of this is how, to my mind, how crucial the art world is in all of this. I think that the art world over the last decade has been able to produce such extraordinarily inventive protocols around acts of learning, acts of engaging with knowledge. If I think just of what happened to that thing called reading group, which when we were all students was about coming to terms with an incredibly difficult text that you couldn't come to terms with by yourself. Right? So it was a completely instrumental thing. If 5 of us read a text by Deleuze, maybe we'll get it. And whereas the sort of the reading group, which takes place in the university against the university, and takes place in the art space against the principle of spectacle and display and the accumulation of objects and so on. I mean, just that little thing called the reading group, which has extraordinary potentials. I mean, and some of its potentials is that it kind of animates a whole publishing. The way these people put together their readers, publishers should pay attention in terms of what goes with what and what doesn't go with what, and what they think illuminates this and that problem. So I think that the art world has been able to, first of all, produce incredibly direct accesses to knowledge production and research, and incredibly inventive protocols, for these. And the reason I think there's been this kind of lateral movement across the board is very largely due to the way in which the art world has been able to kind of come in and offer something new. And I think I haven't spent enough time in this instance talking about it, but I feel quite strongly about it. Do you want to go and have a drink and some food and something like that?
Okay, the last short question.
So, so my concern would be that when you portray infrastructures as being eminently capitalist, that
Which sectors?
infrastructures. So you've stated.
No. I don't think they're eminently capitalist. I think infrastructures are the building blocks, the unnamed building blocks of contemporary capitalism.
But I think in the same way it's the material world around us that is not infrastructural, and in the same way it's art, and in the same way it's critical thought. All of them can be, in that sense, put to use in the commodity production and can serve ultimately to generate profit. What I would say is crucial when we think about infrastructures, and I would define infrastructures as forms of abstraction, just as critical thinking is, or criticality, just as art is, though it deals with how to get a set of material resources to a number of people. But the crucial question is then how this abstraction is transforming in the conjecture, and how it's becoming more or less commodified and delivered to more or less of people. I think that's the crucial question. Once we start tackling those, we come basically to where we act politically or not, and not whether we just detect if they are part of the reproduction of the capitalist system or
But
not.
that's not what I was talking about at all. So, so first of all, infrastructure comes with a promise. No infrastructure comes without a promise. And the sort of and the promise is always this kind of interweaving of, you know, what capital sees as progress, what neoliberalism sees as progress, the kind of promise that is invested in sort of cutting-edge knowledge production, and and of course the sort of ability to occupy unlimited terrains. I mean, it's expansionist. So infrastructure is always premised on a promise. And that promise is the sort of interweaving of a set of values with a set of expansions. I think Nancy talks about it. I think it's probably the most interesting discussion of it in the creation of the world, when he says, one of the things that's happened within the mechanism of globalization is that proliferation has familiarity and knowledge. So endless proliferation of something comes to stand in for its knowledge or a real familiarity with it. It's a kind of surface familiarity at the level of the sign. And I think infrastructure is deeply imbricated in that. But what interests me is infrastructure in relation to education, infrastructure in relation to culture, and the fact that it is structures and the occupation of those structures and the promises of delivery, and at the same time the recognition that all of that is going ahead as well as its opposite. You know, that its opposite is going on all the time. And so, for me, actually, the argument about abstraction is not a useful one in this particular project. I'm not saying that you can't think about infrastructure as a kind of a leveling out and abstraction, but it's not useful for me in this project, because that's not what I'm talking about.
Okay, I think we should have a drink. That's a good idea. Thank you again.